Crown24 back today with episode 2 in my grading masterclass. Today we're going to be taking a look at subgrades and autogrades. I figured this was a good place to get into the more in-depth look. I know that the first episode was more so of an overview of the TPGs and kind of grading in general. But this one is going to cover more so the aspects that go into a card's assigned grade. So we'll talk about the 4 major subgrades as well as autograph grades and a little bit more about those as well. So kind of an overview of the series. This is what I put up last time. If you want to pause the video and take a look at it, or go back to the previous episode and hear me talk about it more in depth, that is available to you. But looking at the actual subgrades themselves, a subgrade is something that I define as a numerical value assigned to evaluate a specific aspect of a card. When these values are combined, it produces a composite grade. Now, out of the 3 TPGs, which I'll give a little reminder of what those are here later on in the presentation, Beckett's the only one that actually displays subgrades and gives an assigned subgrade. Now, probably in your head thinking, well, I don't really submit with Beckett, or I'm not a fan of Beckett's slabs. Why do I need to know this? I'll tell you that in a minute. But these subgrades are also going to go into, say, a PSA or an SGC grade. You're just not going to get a numerical assigned grade for these specific categories. But these are definitely all factors that boil down to what your overall grade is going to be. And you can take a look at them there. Now, there might be something else that you could argue. You could make a case for it. But in general, any issue that you would think of with a card is going to fall into one of these 4 categories. And you can see down at the bottom I have the asterisk next to the autograph grade, which is kind of a separate thing. We will talk about that in a minute. But the 4 major types of subgrades you have: centering, corners, edges, and surface. So why this is important, whoops, almost gave you a spoiler there. Why this is important is these are, again, the factors that are going to go into giving your card an assigned grade. That might not be displayed on the label, like I said with Beckett, but they are definitely things that PSA or SGC are also looking at very closely when they go to grade your cards. So that's something that you can take into consideration when you're looking over your cards to submit for grading. For me, I kind of do a mental checklist where I'm going to make sure I look over those 4 things in particular. I don't really have a specific order of how I do them. Usually, if I'm thinking just off the top of my head, spitballing here, I'll take a look for any major damages that I see with the naked eye, and then after that I'll go under magnification to check the corners and the edges. That's usually what I look at first, and then from there I'll make sure that there's no major issues with the surface. After that, centering is kind of, you can pretty much tell on centering with the naked eye. It has a very easy eye appeal test. You can also use subgrades, especially if you're going to be using BGS at all in the process, for crossover submissions. So that's if you're going to BGS or you are switching from BGS, which the latter is the more common of crossover submissions. And then how these subgrades can also impact the value on the secondary market of your cards. So we start off with the 4 subgrades, a little bit more about each one. Centering, something that I would define as a measurement of how well a card fits within a border or a hypothetical border. There are a lot of designs, if you think about Topps flagship in particular, where there hasn't been borders in recent years. If you kind of look at the digital mock-ups for the cards, you can kind of get a good feel of what the centering is supposed to look like, and from there you can, in your head, draw imaginary borders, or perhaps use reference of where certain images are supposed to be in terms of their distance from the actual edges to kind of determine what is good centering on one of those types of cards. There's 2 types of centering that you'll take a look at, and that would be top to bottom. So I'll pull my little cursor on screen here. Hopefully you can see it. This top edge here to this bottom edge, by the way, we're going to use this Mike Trout as kind of our sample card for today's episode. And then also comparing this left side to this right side, just in terms of the thickness of the border. There is a term in the hobby that we call dead centering. So that would be, if you look at the card, you want it to be a 50-50 split ideally between the top and the bottom in terms of how much space is there, and then left to right you want it to be also a 50-50 split. Now, to get a perfect split like that, It's pretty difficult. There's not really anything you can do to control centering. It's how the card comes out of the pack, which can make it kind of frustrating if you get an off-centered card out of the pack, but everything else on it looks absolutely gorgeous. Me personally, I'm a big centering guy, so this is definitely the subgrade that I'm going to look at most closely on the secondary market if I'm going to be buying a card that is graded, or even a raw card that I would just like for my collection, even if I have no intention of grading it. But dead centered would be a 50-50 split. But if you have a little bit off one way or another, then generally you're going to have that, it's going to gem for you on that specific subgrade. Or I guess be pristine, depending on which term you would like to use. So then if we move on to the edges, in my experience, this is one of the easiest subgrades. But when I say easiest, that is definitely relative compared to different categories of subgrades. It is not easy to get a 10 in grading. Let me make that perfectly clear. That's a myth that should be debunked. It's definitely not easy to get a 10 straight out of the pack. There are a lot of minor issues that come straight from the manufacturer of the card. With edges, though, you're going to see two very prevalent issues on cards that do have edge issues. You have the rough cuts or the dark colored borders. So if you think about, you have a white sheet of printer paper and you draw on it with yellow crayon and then you draw on it with black crayon, which one shows up better? It's going to be the one with the black crayon. And a lot of times with these darker color cards, the surface, the very top layer of the cardstock is going to be the part that is colored. Beneath that is just the regular white cardstock, especially on the thicker cards that they are printed on, but even a standard size 20-point card, you're going to see that as well. So if there is chipping on that top layer, which it can happen for any type of card, say you have a white bordered card, it's not going to show up as well as it would on a black border or a navy blue border card, just because that white is going to have a greater contrast with those darker colors. So that is why a lot of times you see issues with those darker colored cards, and why they grade lower is because it's more noticeable on the damage to those types of cards. Now, if I were to say that edges are the easiest of the four subgrades, I would then have to follow it up with the corners, which I would say is arguably the toughest of the four to get a 10 on, just because this is kind of a weak point. This is where you have the vertices of two edges. I won't necessarily say that there's four corners in a card, because you have die cuts and a whole bunch of interesting different ways that cards are cut now. But where two edges meet is a vertice, which is a corner. And everybody knows corners. That's usually two big camps in terms of what people look for with subgrades of their cards. There are corner guys, quote unquote. You can't see me doing my air quotes. And centering guys. But the corner guys, it's definitely, they have a very large following. Same struggles as the edges with the dark colored borders. It's going to lead to some more issues. And again, these are more sensitive. You don't have the supports really that an edge would have. If you think about the human body, what happens more often? Do you have pain in your bones or pain in your joints? It's usually the joints, because it's where two areas meet. There's not as much sturdy connection that's in there. It's a little bit weaker, a little bit more vulnerable. The same kind of principle can be applied to the corners. And we'll wrap that part up with the surface. So just looking at the top layer of a card, how smooth is it? Does it have any scratches? Does it have any indentations, any dimples, any refractor lines? Sometimes on some of the refractors, there might be print lines that come straight from the manufacturer. These are particularly problematic in cards that have X-fractor or prism type of technologies to them. If you're looking at Topps and Bowman, you can see it too in some of the Panini prism type of cards, but those kind of technologies are definitely the ones that you'll want to really take a close look at, because they can be sometimes very subtle, and they can cost you a 10 on those. And this is going to be more so something that you see again on those chrome cards, which is why I mentioned the X-fractors and the prism refractors. Surface, generally not as big of a concern on a card that is papers, as we call them, paper cards, but chrome cards, you definitely see a bigger issue. Using soft sleeves to store your cards can definitely help with the surface. That will protect it. from scratches, which the chrome cards can be very easily scratched, so you definitely want to make sure you take good protection and good care when you're dealing with chrome cards. When you move into autograph grades, now this is something that's separate. It doesn't go into the four that the other ones go into. But a lot of times people will use a dual service with SGC or PSA, or with Beckett, they'll use this dual service to have an assigned autograph grade. This is very prevalent in Beckett slabs in particular, especially with your contenders and your first Bowman autographs. And some of the things that you'll look for with autograph grades is maybe the streakiness or changes in pen pressure as a signature lighter in some spots because the signer isn't putting as much pressure on the pen when they're signing it. Perhaps some stray marks that you might see because they accidentally nick the card with a Sharpie, or they have to try to correct their name because they put the wrong letter in. You only get one shot at it. The ink is permanent. Then kind of the framing of the autograph as well. So two major types of autographs. You have your sticker autograph. So did the athlete keep the autograph completely on the sticker? Or for on card, there's usually a window that is given. Doesn't necessarily have a defined border in a lot of cases, but generally you know where the autograph is supposed to go. Did the athlete put it in that spot and keep it within that spot and not go out onto the edges of the card or something? That can help with a better autograph grade. So a quick reminder of our TPGs. Again, with PSA and SGC, you're not going to have those subgrades on the label themselves, but they will go into consideration when giving you an assigned grade. The subgrades are most notorious with Beckett. It's not something that they automatically do. It is an additional fee to get the subgrades, but generally most people who grade with Beckett are going to use the service that gives them the subgrades. And kind of the last note that I'll have here today is true grades. And this is something that really applies to Beckett. So if you're not a Beckett fan, this is something that you won't have to worry about as much. But a true grade is when all of these subgrades are greater than or equal to the composite grade. So if you look at our example card here, the Mike Trout, it has a 9.5 on the corners and surface and a 10 on the edges, which beats the 9.5 gem mint grade that the card overall received. However, it has 9 centering. So what this means is that the card is not considered a true gem. It's not all the subgrades. If it was a true gem, all the subgrades would be 9.5 or above. And these are definitely more sought after on the secondary market to have a true gem. Just as I mentioned earlier in the video, not all grades are created equal. So this is kind of a better version of a gem mint card. Also, it plays into consideration with a crossover. Generally, if you're going from BGS to PSA or SGC, you're going to want to have all 9.5s or better on the subgrades in order to cross over to a 10 with the other companies. Otherwise, you might be looking at a 9 because, as you can see in this case here, this card's still graded out at 9.5, which is a gem mint, despite the 9 on the centering. If you were to send this card to PSA, they might see the centering, think it's a 9 within their heads, and then dock your card down to a 9 overall. And the secondary market values vary from card to card in terms of, is a PSA 9 worth more than a Beckett 9.5? That's kind of a case-by-case basis if you're looking to cross over. But true grades is definitely something that you want to take a careful look at, especially if you are dealing with Beckett cards. So that is it for me today. Appreciate you guys checking out the video. I should have another one of these up sometime in the near future. But hopefully you found this helpful. Again, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Until then, have yourselves a good one.